And then when it comes to the left-hand side, then if you decide how much you need to reduce, well, then you need to say, okay, how much is China doing, how much is US doing, and how much is EU doing? And that's where you have all the debate that you hear is pretty much here. There's not so much debate about this or about this, where we all need to go in the future, which is something we're trying to shift. And of course, we want to see something Copenhagen coming out that is also legally binding. That it's not only a commitment like a target set up, but it's actually some legally binding that 40% below 1919 emission by 2020 for Europe, for example, or 30%, whatever they decide, will be a legally binding target. And then that there will be some penalties going out if you're not reaching that target, and how that system would look like. And then the big issue, the big question at the moment, and finally, the financing. So how much should humanity invest in all this, and how much money? Well, there are so many proposals on the table going. I think everyone's heard the Stern reports calling for like 1% of global GDP, 2% of global GDP later, somewhere between $500 billion per year or $1 trillion per year. We're saying that that's the kind of level you need to see, but the public investment component of that then need to be about $160 billion per year in order to leverage these private investments that are needed. But it needs to be public funds in order for this big leverage to happen. We need to act fast, as you've seen. And then on financing a deal, the negotiations now is that EU has presented a proposal that is a lot lower than developing countries were expecting, and also what we were expecting. But still, it's a proposal on the table. No other developed countries have done that, so that's positive. And then there's the G20 meetings. They are discussing this financing of a deal in detail, which is the 20 biggest nations, and then which is now the four of us going to replace the G8 that was said in the meeting last week. And on a positive side from that meeting, that it's not specifically gone into a deal. There's now been actually an agreement that we need to phase out fossil fuels. And if you look at the amount of fossil fuels we're using, fossil subsidies, sorry, we need to phase out fossil subsidies, and that will hopefully lead to the phasing out of fossil fuels. But if you're looking at the annual investment in fossil subsidies, it's actually a lot bigger than what we're asking for to go in to a global climate deal in annual expenditure globally. But then again, some of that is well needed in order for poor people to have lighting, for example. But also at the G20, it's all the question of how do we take part of the big, huge investments that are going to happen in the future, not least in urban infrastructure. 75% of all emissions are coming from cities around the world, and there's going to be somewhere between $100 and $300 trillion invested in urban infrastructure over the next 30 or so years. So that's like $100,000 billion that's going to be invested, and that needs to be invested in a low-carbon fashion rather than a high-carbon fashion, and that will need a public seed funding for that shift to happen. And that's also where the massive, massive clean tech and business opportunities lie. And then the big question is, will we set the stage for this in Copenhagen, or will it take maybe longer in order to come to a global agreement that this is needed?